Hi, welcome back to Ethics TV. This is Jonathan MacDonald here, and today I'm joined by Kirk Mensch. And we were just about to start speaking about some really cool stuff, and then I pressed record just in time. So Kirk, the last 60 seconds, let's reverse and repeat. What has been keeping you busy, Kirk?
The last few years, I've been working on a project at the university to develop a new program. It's been quite an adventure. When I started, moved out of the Intel community and into this teaching and years ago, I don't ever remember seeing a master's program in ethics. And now it seems that like it our enrollments increased dramatically. I really can't believe how much interest there is. And I think the combination of what we've done in the program is sort of taken ethics and psychology and combined them, into sort of this interdisciplinary inquiry into all kinds of different matters. And so uh, colleagues are writing papers on so many different contexts, whether it has to do with transgender athletics or whether it has to do with AI. There's a lot of us working on AI projects right now, and I just think that it's something that is growing, and there's a reason that it's growing. And I'm not sure that all the reasons that there's such this interest in ethics are good reasons necessarily. Um, I think there's a lot of dabbling in ethics that maybe concerns me a little bit, but yeah, I wanted to infuse that into a program because through my career and my experience, um, it's always it's been a part of my life. But I think after I served in Afghanistan in combat, and I think after that, I had a lot of reflection that I forced upon myself, if you will, and it really sort of changed the trajectory of my life because in my first PhD program, I studied ethics from sort of a developmental psychological perspective, um, but I really hadn't studied philosophical ethics. Uh, I've been
Mm,
shocked at how many PhDs I run into around not only the U.S. but in general. And I remember speaking on one time that just got a PhD in psychology and had never taken a course in philosophy ever, never taken a single actual philosophy class. And I thought that was striking to me because it's a doctor of philosophy in something, right? That's what it's supposed to be. But I
yeah.
think we've gotten so far away from those type of discussions, um, that there's sort of this pendulum swing, I think, back, and people
Mhm.
are searching sort of and questioning things that they didn't question 20, 30 years ago. Not in my experience. I think a lot of people thought that with advanced quantitative methods and structural equation modeling and all these things, we could figure things out to a point where maybe we could develop a new forms of ethics. And what I've seen is a shift back to virtue ethics, which is another thing. Which 20 years ago, if you would have brought up virtue ethics, maybe it was because my undergrad was economics and they're a little bit skewed towards consequentialism and utilitarianism. But
Yeah.
if you would have brought up virtue ethics back then, they would have laughed you right out of the room. And now
Yeah.
it seems to be sort of the predominant area of inquiry within ethics. And I think that's because, being honest, I think there's been a failure in application in other forms of ethical inquiry. And so I think it's been a fascinating journey, the creation of a new program, and now we're taking students to universities in the UK. Just this summer, we took a couple of our students there, and they presented their master's theses. It was just so incredible to see, all around centered around ethical inquiry, and it just fascinating.
Wow. So there's two parts of that I wanted to pick up on. The first is that there it seems relatively straightforward to draw the kind of a red thread between your let's say your veteran status and the let's say when you're a US intelligence community officer, you've that kind of background almost cannot result in some form of ethical inquiry to some extent. So I can see a thread, and I'm wondering whether or not there is, would you say that, because it is not that in the last 200 years we haven't in the Western world been shy of having um, experiences that are existential. So it can't be that the impetus that would drive an ethical inquiry hasn't been there, because there has been enough impetus to drive ethical inquiry. So that's not it. So if there is it then that our failings that you allude to are in some parts due to a replacement of our ethical inquiry to our fascination with comparative media celebrities, what's happening with the Kardashians. Maybe we've replaced our dogma with a desire for capitalist gain as opposed to a spiritual inward journey. I mean, I'm stretching, but I'm trying to find the first principles reasoning as to why there's been a movement away from an ethical inquiry.
I think if you look back over history, when I say failing, I really mean sort of the most postmodern thinking, ethical thinking. It's not. I don't think it's been successfully applied consistently, and I think I really will say that Alistair MacIntyre really brought something to the table in 1990. He wrote his book Three Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry, and when he means rival, he means incommensurate, incompatible, untranslatable with each other. And what if you look around the globe today, in the United States today, we just had our presidential election, and very heated election, obviously, and I think what you see is a war going on between ethics, a certain type of ethics, which is really a relativistic form of ethics. There's this major camp. If you read any ethics textbooks, because I teach history of ethics, so if you read any ethics textbook, they always want to break things into all these different categories. But I mean, for me, it's kind of the way I see it these days is you sort of have this subjectivist, relativist sort of category on the one hand, where ethics maybe can be derived from emotion or feelings or just because you believe what you believe and I believe what I believe, and so we use respect for persons to sort of validate that kind of thinking. But there is a large majority of the world that believes in that ethics come from somewhere else, right? That still believe in a divine, in God or the divine, and they believe in sacred texts. And so one of the things I've noticed in the academy is that having that discussion, I mean, it's probably most visible in the United States, where like Princeton, wonderful university, right? And then right across the street is Princeton Theological Seminary, right? And so you don't even have theology taught at Princeton. You can get a degree in religion, but as last time I looked, they have nothing else besides this. So that's just one example of where you can see the divide in these camps. Psychology, I spoke a few years ago at an annual psychology conference, and when I walked into the conference, I don't remember how I was going to start the conversation, but when I walked into the conference, there was 3 tables, and the one table was focused on cognitive behavioral and dialectic behavioral therapy. Waterman called this humanistic psychology, right? And then there was the positive psychology table. That's like Marty Seligman's group out of UPenn and stuff like that, right? And then there was the Christian psychology and counseling movement. And there were these 3 tables out in front of this, where I was going into the conference center at this big Marriott to do the presentation. And when they called me to do the presentation, I said, have you read any of my papers? Because I haven't been a friend to psychology generally. No, that's why we want you to speak. So I went there and I started off by saying, I saw these 3 tables out front, and those 3 tables are what I'm here to talk about. And those 3 tables, they come from incommensurate moral traditions. The humanistic tradition is not commensurate with the positive psychology tradition, which is not commensurate with obviously with the Christian counseling movement and psychology, right? I mean, these are opposing traditions. And anyways, I gave this lecture, and I was literally like rushed at the stage afterwards. And I remember this one gentleman. He said, "I used to be a pastor. Many years ago, I was a pastor before I got into becoming a psychologist." And he said, "From what you've said, I have to change my entire thinking of my practice because I currently use therapies that I realize now are not in line with my own belief systems, much less the belief systems of some of the people that I'm counseling," which is one of the problems with psychology. The first question maybe they should ask are questions about what it is you believe, what your belief systems are. Because whenever you encounter something like that, and this goes to AI, the thing we're doing with AI, these encounters, whether it be human to human encounter or human to artificial intelligence, I think the thing that keeps me up at night is the fear that influence over the individual moral agent will continue to increase as we sort of, if we allow, I should say, AI to continue in the path that I see it on, which is not a path of transparency, which is not, I think you mentioned capitalism in this thing. That's part of my fear, that capitalism takes over, the transparency lessens, and people lose their moral autonomy without even really knowing.
That's right. Yeah, well, I fear the same, and I mean, I wonder of all of the atrocities. Sorry, I don't want to be too dramatic. I think it's fair. Yeah, of all of the atrocities that one could level at the progression of, let's say, less benevolent artificial intelligence, my primary concern is in the definition of or rather the taxonomy in and of itself, artificial intelligence, and the misnomer of intelligence, and that the placement of that misnomer is of concern to me, not least the fact that to create something that is more capable than humans or is superior to human intellect would require us to forego the entire emotional intelligence and whatever we call the chariots to the charioteer, whatever we would like to class this as. We have to forego that. We have to assume that intellect is almost exclusively based on being better or worse at calculations or at chess or whatever. We'd have to assume that. And then in that construct, in that aperture, we then can have a race between a computer that can solve something faster or less fast than a human, and then class that as being more human or being a replication of what humans are needed for. And that is a significant concern to me, because whilst we are creating a taxonomy that is then becoming normalized in our kind of Overton window of what's acceptable, we are to do that, we have to degrade the thing that makes humans human so that we can create the taxonomy. So it's not even the atrocities of the technology, it is in the construct, the framework itself is a problem for me from a foundational philosophical perspective.
I think you're pointing out what AI can never do is part of the problem that we face. AI can never truly have empathy, right? AI can never, I mean, I would argue that AI can never truly philosophize. AI can never walk out on I live on a mountain in the Appalachian Mountains. It can never walk out on my mountain, look up at the moon, see Pluto next to it like I did earlier, and just see the beauty in that. Mm-hmm. And so there's always going to be something missing. Mm-hmm. The problem that bothers me about, you mentioned words and how words are utilized in some of this conversation. I was listening to something recently, or reading something recently, and I just remember this phrase. They were trying to instill our values within these AI frameworks. But when they used the word "are," they meant humans and AI, as if AI could understand and have its own values. Now, something else you mentioned, I think Hawking talked about this in 2018, something about superhuman intelligence and his greatest fear of them having their own will. And if their will has a different goal than ours and they're more intelligent, who wins, right? It's sort of a simple thing that he was stating, but it makes sense. And so when you look at it from the ethical perspective, I think it becomes much more complicated because of, in the paper we wrote, I actually referenced Huxley in 31 when he wrote the book. I think it was a Brave New World. He talks about information. He basically is talking about information overload, and then he's talking about like radio and televisions and what do we have going on now? I mean, any university professor will tell you there's been a massive change in pretty much everything that goes on in the classroom from pre sort of smartphones and all this technology that's been brought into the classroom. We're really struggling right now. I think all of us in the profession are struggling on how we integrate that in a healthy way that develops students in the way that we want to develop them, and also mitigate the risk. I don't think we can remove the risks. I mean, students are going to do what they do, and and the risks are going to be there. But we can try to mitigate them. And I think that's one of the steps forward that I was talking about. Instead of what I see too much of, and this is just my perspective, but I see too much of media, big tech, trying to promote all the positives of AI. And when they talk about what you were referring to, possible atrocities or things that could go wrong with AI, it doesn't seem like it's the same kind of a conversation. It seems like this could happen, but it's, many years from now, there's nothing to worry about, nothing to see here. After studying what I've been studying in AI and ethics for the last 2 years, just to write a single paper, it's definitely more than that.
Yes, that's fair. Even probabilistically, it's more than that. I think there is words are so important and definitions are so important and can be weaponized so easily and seemingly in a castaway kind of cast off meaningless way of kind of saying, well, yeah, sure, when we say things are ethical, that we're an ethical company. I mean, if someone does if a viewer of this goes onto their favorite search engine and searches most ethical companies 2024 at the time of recording, the results will be including the very same companies who have been found guilty of committing crimes against the Universal Declaration of human independence. Let's say if the Declaration of Human Rights was law, but data breaches, abuse of privacy, big tech companies being found out with their hand in the cookie jar, saying, "Oh yeah, sorry, we have been using facial recognition and bio tracking, and okay, sure, we won't do it again, honest gov." But they're the same companies that are called the most ethical companies. Words are so important because even our definition of what is ethical it can be aberrated. And I mean, it's interesting in the abstract of your forthcoming paper that as we discussed, I've put a clue to what the title may include in the title of this particular episode. The last part of that abstract is you say, and I'm paraphrasing here, something along the lines of that you're going to recommend how to identify problematic interactions and reduce risks related to human flourishing. And so if we take this away from definitions and taxonomies and potential malevolent behavior by big tech companies, which we could spend hours on debating, looking at it from a human flourishing perspective, is it the case, in your opinion, or your current thesis or hypothesis, that one could judge, or let's say calibrate the ethical nature of technology based on the levels of human flourishing that it either reduces or accelerates? Would we be able to calibrate it in that way?
Potentially, but I've studied probability and statistics for probably too long. So when you start trying to, this is part of the problem that I was explaining. So I was trying to say about the different, these three rival versions of moral inquiry, these three different, if you will, ethical worldviews or philosophical ways of living, if you will, that they're incommensurate. So what you're alluding to is, so how would we get to that metric of flourishing, right? If we get to the metric of flourishing by numbers, then we fall into the utilitarian trap, right? So, what's good for the greatest number, except what if the greatest number is only 51%, right? And what about the 49%? Remember Brexit? I didn't mean to bring Brexit.
Brilliant.
I used to live in the UK, but I went to Exeter for my second PhD, so I kind of have to throw that one in there every once in a while. But yeah, pure democracy, sometimes it works, and sometimes maybe you wanted to break it up into some smaller factions or whatever. But I think, and you brought up human flourishing. It was interesting when you were talking about companies. Amazon came to mind, and I just, because there is something about Amazon in our paper, and I was just on Amazon shopping the other day, and I thought to myself, I always think this when I look at it, but it was like, how does it know what I'm looking for when I'm not actually looking for that? Now I sort of know how that happens, but what I thought the other day was, what am I missing that it's influencing me to do, right? What in other words, am I making a purchase that is helping me to flourish, or am I making a purchase that big tech wants me to make a purchase of? And so they have ways of doing it, right? And if you've noticed with certain algorithms that they use, obviously, just in this case, for example, and it's with a lot of companies like this, they hit you with it over and over and over again, right? And so it's sort of like almost a wearing down process. And we equate this to healthcare with ER doctors that maybe are exhausted, or people that have I don't mean cognitively impaired. I mean it like they're exhausted, or they could be in many different ways, but finding them at their weakness is kind of the point I'm getting at, right? And so when you think of just something as simple as that, of making an online purchase, am I making the purchase that is really good for Kirk, or am I making a purchase for any other reason, and for any other reason would not be flourishing for me? I suppose.
I agree, and in fact, my view of self-sovereignty in terms of our experience requires us to be the masters of technology and not the other way around, so as to avoid that. And this links to what I wonder, and I've mentioned this in several episodes, and at the time of recording this, we're almost getting up to 100,000 viewers of Ethics TV, which is, bearing in mind I launched it like 7 weeks ago with no advertising. So I don't quite understand why that happened, but I've mentioned this quite a few times in the episodes, and so I'll float it now under this circumstance of what's right for Kirk versus what's right for any other reason that isn't the agent themselves. And that is whether or not we could apply the Asimov's 3 or 4, including the Zeroth law of robotics here, in a way that could be relatively well defended. So if we have like a robot and we can interchange robots and artificial intelligence for the cause of this journey. So a robot must obey orders given to it by human beings, except a robot must not injure a human through inaction or allow a human being to come to harm. Secondly, a robot must obey orders given to a human being by human beings, except if they would conflict with the first order. The third is that a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with points 1 and 2. And then the zeroth law that Asimov then proposed was that a robot must not harm humanity or by inaction allow humanity to come to harm. So if we took those 4 laws of robotics, placed them onto technology in general, what would be the problem with saying we must not create any form of technology that can harm humans when there is a paradoxical status there in terms of needing to create technologies that defend our shores and defend our cities and defend our people? So we have to immediately, not even by taking a breath of stating the first laws, do we need to immediately break the laws and say, apart from when someone has thrown a missile into us.
Right. Yeah, and I think you've just explained the great paradox in all of this, right? It's what a lot of the sort of dystopian writers over the past 50 years have sort of alluded to, right? It's not that those laws wouldn't be good laws and that we couldn't, it's not that we couldn't do it the right way. It's that if you throw one bad actor in there, it throws a wrench in the entire thing, because there's that missile coming at you, right? And if that missile has better technology than yours, it makes it through the Iron Dome, for example, right? I mean, these are things that I think people are just starting to become aware of because of like the war dogs that are being used already on the battlefield, and drone technology. And you know, I was in Afghanistan when the first Hellfire missile was fired from a Predator drone, for example. And you know, so this technology has been around for a long time. It's just it's growing exponentially, I think faster than we can get a grasp on what the ramifications of it may be in the long run. Because I think, especially when it comes to some of the things you were mentioning with warfare, it's happening so fast and under desperate circumstances that I don't think that people are sitting back, you know, on their porches with a nice cold iced tea, thinking about all the ramifications that may come about what we're about to do. No, they're thinking we need to take this action now to stave off this one thing. But it builds on each other. You know, over time this builds up, and now we're to a point where, I mean, are we even going to have pilots in aircraft? There's no need to anymore. We don't need them. We're still churning pilots out for fighter aircraft, but we don't need them. In fact, the aircraft can fly better without the pilot.
Yep.
Right. So, I mean, you brought up I think the great dilemma, and that is, if I could sort of try to rephrase it, it's sort of like we can see that there's this path of human flourishing that could take place. There's so much great potential in artificial intelligence. There already is. I mean, I may speak of some things that negatively it may affect doctors, for example, or people in healthcare that have to make decisions in the last minute, and perhaps they're just defaulting to whatever the AI is telling them, and they're not really using their own judgment. I mean, yeah, there's all this thing, but it's also creating, you know, cures to new diseases and extending life and doing all these things. So I think you kind of nailed it with the paradox that it's not going anywhere. And the problem is what do we do about it? And I don't feel like there's a lot of great answers out there right now. And so what I'm trying to do is create, which I'm so thankful that you're doing something like this, because you're doing what has to come before that, is we have to have a rational discussion. People need to sit down and be able to openly talk about these things. But when you start bringing in these incommensurate moral traditions, I mean, it's no secret in the academy that there's certain moral traditions that aren't very well accepted. You know, if you walk into certain universities and you're, you know, you have a cross on your chest, or you know, you're openly religious and believe in the sacred text, for example. I mean, I don't think it's any great secret, you know, that at least in the United States, I mean, that's not something that people want to, at least historically over the past maybe 50 years or so going around wanted to say, because it was more about scientism and all these other answers. And so those kind of belief systems were looked down upon because they were looked at as diminishing your reasoning capabilities, or something like this. Like you would discount things. I mean, these are Dawkins sort of like, and Christopher Hitchens. These are their, sort of atheist, or anti-theist, I should say, to be more precise, sort of attacks that I think have become a little bit, redundant, to say the least, if not, just.
Yeah, well, it was interesting. I've actually interviewed a pastor on this show, and along with a whole collection of people who are running AI for good stuff, the AI 2030 agenda. Some of the people involved in the European Union regulation stuff, and so I've interviewed. I've actually, in the last 16, your episode 17, I think, last 16 episodes, I've interviewed a whole bunch of people, and some of them who are from a strongly religious background, specifically the pastor that I was mentioning, Jonathan Lightfoot. There seems to be a neat fit between, let's say, spirituality and ethical technology. I noticed that you spoke at an event in July, I think June or July this year. I think you were on table 3 on the Friday morning. I've spent the last week researching you, so I've cyber stalked the hell out of everything you've done. But I noticed that at that event there was definitely a let's say, to be generous to my ignorance, a theologian leaning to some of the discussions. And I do find it interesting how the spiritual component to ethical technology seems to be a relatively neat bedfellow, to such an extent that, and this is going to be supremely insulting to anyone who's watching here with actual qualifications in this area. From my perspective, it seems that let me really bastardize this point down. One of the ways that we can grapple with the topic of how to make technology more ethical is to look to the Bible and say, should we not just be more decent humans as written here? And I think that's kind of where the bedfellowing is, or the grandfathering of that. It's kind of taking as kind of like, see, it says it in the book, therefore if we did that. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, is that an opportunistic correlation from a statistician's point of view? Is this an ascriptive causality, or is there an actual causality here that we can see?
I don't know if there's a causality. I think it might be the other way around, in a way. If you remember what I was saying at the beginning, where 30 years ago there wasn't many people talking about ethics in the way that they talk about them today. It just wasn't. It just didn't exist. So, it's sort of like, did the chicken come before the egg or whatever? It's like, I think, from my perspective, this conversation started to change 20, 30 years ago. And when virtue ethics started to come back into the conversation. And, when you mentioned, I don't tend to put much on religion. But from a theological perspective, I think that couples well with virtue ethics, and so therefore it sort of may be coming more a part of the discussion. I think the other side of the discussion is still what it is, though, and it's utilitarianism. It's what people normally go to, right? It's like, well, okay, so what good can we do for the most amount of people? The problem is my research and what we tend to focus on are individuals. I'm very concerned about where all of this takes us as individuals, and the rights and the privileges, if you will, that we have right now. What are they going to look like in the future as things continue to progress, if they continue to progress in the way that they are? And I think the only way to really stem that is to have these discussions. And I'm not sure what you were talking about in July. If you're talking about the International Society for MacIntyrean Inquiry, I
That's it. Yeah.
yeah, at the University of Reading in the UK, I spoke there. Um, there, I will tell you, I've been a member of that society for a long time, and there is definitely a lot more focus on virtue ethics, and the application thereof, especially when it comes to technology and some of the challenges we have currently, um, at the conference than there was 20 years ago. So, and I see that everywhere. I'm even the work that me and my colleagues are doing, related to AI and ethics. I don't think it's the AI side that people find so fascinating. It's what we're really getting at, and that is that we have these different moral traditions in the world, and it's going to come down to, are we going to force people into a tradition, or are we going to allow them to maintain their moral autonomy and their own belief systems? And am I going to be able to? I'll just give you an example that just came to mind. Thinking of somewhere. Well, if you think about it in the Bible, there were times when Rome had the Christians hiding in their rooms to pray because they weren't allowed to pray in public. I mean, is this where we're going? I mean, that might sound crazy, but it's already happened once. It's happened many times over history. If you look back over history, religion gets crushed, if you want to call it religion. But I'm more worried about belief systems because, I don't put my belief system, for example, in a religion. My belief system is in a faith. There's things that science and things like that are never going to convince me of, or and this is part of the problem. We have to be able to sit down at the table and have the discussion on topics where one party is never going to convince the other party that they're right, and maybe they shouldn't have to, right? Mm-hmm. Abortion's a very divisive problem in America. It was the number one issue for one of the parties in the election, and there are people that you put down at a table, and you're never going to convince some of those people that abortion is good, or and you can call it whatever you want. You could call it killing a baby, you can call it reproductive rights. All these euphemisms to me really don't mean very much. At the end of the day, it comes down to belief systems. And so, is there coercion involved? Well, when it comes to AI and the ethics that are involved in AI, that's where I get very concerned. Is that there is coercion involved, but it's hidden. It's often hidden. Sometimes it's very blatant, but other times I think that we don't know how these algorithms are being developed. This is one of the. I just read a paper about how physicians and surgeons are interpreting a data that's provided through the AI systems that they have, and it's not that they don't understand the output. It's that they're concerned that they don't understand how that output was derived, where it came from. They don't understand the algorithm. And so if you don't understand how something was created, and some developers are just saying, well, we've instilled our values into this, I have no idea what that statement means.
Yes, and actually, you've hit a very interesting point, and maybe this is kind of our end topic, launch pad into the wilderness. Is that from a scientific observation perspective, and I'm saying this and I'm not a clinician, so I'm going to say this from although I have a qualification in neuroscience and other things, but I've from a casual observer point of view, there is almost nothing more worrying than any form of technician, scientist, technologist who exclaims that an issue is that the ontology of the experiment is not known, or rather, the ontology of the function is not known, and and it's not a million miles away from a gain of function research lab having a leak that is then retrospectively very hard to manage. And so we then have to immediately forego what would normally be an 8, 10, 12-year FDA process. So, I mean, it's not a million miles away from that, without being too, partisan about this or politicized. At the end of the day, if we're creating something that we don't actually know the functional components of it, mind you, one could say that the the revolutions of, as Thomas Kuhn would say, the structure of scientific revolutions over time is we think we've found some form of answer, therefore to be scientific, we then need to break that apart to form a new paradigm and so forth. In the same way as we thought that the atom was the smallest particle for a significant period of time. So maybe that's how we learn, is we are um, somewhat blissfully ignorant. Although this seems to have a slightly different characteristic. This is the experiment itself is looking back at us and coming up with new things that we didn't input into it. Whereas if you're experimenting with something and it's in a petri dish and you put a chemical in, you can see what happens to the rest of the petri dish. Whereas now it's kind of like we don't put anything other into the petri dish, and then the construct of the petri dish then changes. And we look at it and go, we don't know, we don't know why that happened. Hooray! That's an issue for me, just from a casual observer perspective.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned Thomas Kuhn. And I think that's part of the thing that is terrifying to me, because his whole concept of paradigm shifts was based on the fact that the paradigm could shift.
That's right.
I mean, what if it gets to a point where it's beyond our control to shift the paradigm? I mean,
Right.
I don't mean to be, flippant. I mean, that's where I think there's a lot of concern right now is, can we make these changes? Can we move in a different direction? Or are we just getting caught up so much in AI's positives that we're setting aside these other things like values and coercion and all these issues that I think people know about? Are we setting them aside? And I think in a way we are. And I think there are entities that want that, because you mentioned, where is it all coming from? Well, at the end of the day, there is someone or some things putting these things together, and they, we've done a lot of experiments asking ChatGPT and some other OpenAI and some of these things like moral questions, and some of the answers are really interesting as a researcher, to sort of dig into, because that's where they start. I did a query a couple of weeks ago, and the AI, when I remember earlier I said about our values, the AI responded to my question with our values in that statement, meaning me and the AI's values. Like it could have values like
Yeah.
me, right?
Yeah.
And so we're already at that point where if somebody has no idea where this is coming from, or they don't know how it's being developed, then they don't know that these developers are putting in their value systems into these algorithms. There's no other way to really
Yeah.
state it.
Yeah, and also I mean, it would be fair to say that by not putting in values into a system, one is also in some way instructing the values or the lack of values of a system. The absence of moralistic values is just as important or just as powerful as the presence of moralistic values, because there's a curve. And so if a developer says, go and experience the whole of Twitter to an AI, and then come back to me and tell me what you think the problem with humanity is, as we found with Microsoft's movement into the AI space. When its AI then queried the whole of Twitter, it turned into a racist within hours, from being exposed to the zeitgeist of what Twitter was discussing. So the absence of a guardrail in that aspect meant that paradoxically, the AI then takes a reflection of humanity, and that's where, in a very obscure way, the presence of values is not just an issue because the developers' values are then inherited by the system, But if one does not do that, then the system will inherit the values of the public or a cross section of the public, which isn't necessarily the best outcome either.
I would say it's definitely often not the best outcome. I won't bring
Brexit.
Brexit up again, but I can bring up many other examples.
Well, I mean, and this is a good place to finish, because I love the good thing about this conversation is that I wrote a book 25 years ago called Every Single One of Us, which was about the same bloody thing as we're talking about now. But when I wrote that, the four people who bought the book that weren't my parents thought I was smoking crack, or they were just like, everyone was like, what? There's no point in this. When 10 years prior to writing that book, I was the first cohort studying what this arguably is kind of around social biology in the early 90s. I was literally in the first cohort in the UK studying a topic that could be the most similar to the combination of psychology and philosophy. And we were a beta experiment, like 32 of us, and we were under the microscope of the British press. It's like, oh, let's see what happens when these people just, discuss the intersection of psychology and philosophy. It's like, well, it would appear to be quite important as philosophically psychological beings, but that aside. So I think, so in closing, what I would love to know is, as you move continually down this path and this moral inquiry, are you optimistic, realistic, pessimistic? Are you buoyant? Are you, especially bearing in mind we're now 6, 7 days after the outcome of the US presidential election? Do you feel the next period in our societies, our humanity, is likely to be kind of catastrophic, and then from the flames our phoenixes grow? Or do you feel as if we have enough tailwind to capture flight because conversations like this are happening? Where's your barometer of positivity there?
I think I want it to be higher than it is on the positive side. I really do. I try. I mean, and me personally, it's why I do what I do. I think it's probably, I'm not going to speak for you, but I assume it's one of the motivating factors that why you're creating Ethics TV. And it has to do, why I created the program at PBA, because we need to have these conversations, and these conversations haven't been had in the context that we're having them for decades. People they haven't had these conversations, and that's the thing that I hope will stop the division, because that's what I see and I mean division in a broad sense. All these divisions that are going on usually come down to issues, more specific issues. But if you go back, it usually has to do with individuals or groups, belief systems that create these opinions or positions that they have. And then we don't yell anymore, or we don't argue in the philosophical sense anymore. It's like who yells the loudest wins is sort of, kind of what's going on out there. And, for my part, I would like to do everything I can to stop that, and to have people come back, to the table and have, respectful discussions, knowing that you may believe what you believe and you're not going to change that, nor am I trying to. But at least we can start by trying to understand each other, and maybe gain perspective on our own belief systems by trying to understand other people's belief systems. And from those ashes, if you will, I think good can come from that. And I hope it's not like Kuhn thought, and the pendulum swings so far the other way that there are literal ashes everywhere. But there's a part of me that worries about that. I think the world's moving very fast in a lot of different directions, and I worry that artificial intelligence, in the case of what we're writing about and we're researching about, may have influences on decision making that is not the outcome that, and this is why I think there's a movement away from consequentialism and that type of thinking, and back to virtue ethics, because consequentialism hasn't worked out very well in a lot of its application. And so I think you're starting something that needs to happen more, and that is bringing various viewpoints, different aspects of the conversation together in a respectful way, where we can start to develop some solutions that are actually viable for all moral agents, not just the majority, which, as you brought up with the TikTok and the way that they're gathering this information to put out, generative AI answers and things like that. That's where do you think it's coming from? And even if you look at some of the answers that come out of those questions, if you put them in a professional context, they can be a little bit concerning, to say the least, because a lot of times I'm afraid they'll lead people down paths where they're under constraints from, I have a family I have to support, I have to do better at this at my job, so that I can afford my kids to go to college, whatever reasoning they have. I've been in those situations, not just in the intelligence community, but at one time I was a stockbroker for Merrill Lynch, and I've had these different careers where I think now, if I put myself in those contexts and I could use AI, people are using AI in ways that I would just ask them, are you using it in a way that's consistent with your own moral schema? Is it consistent with your belief system, with your values? Not what the majority think, but what you think. Because by focusing on the individual, that's where our research it's led to that harm, and probably why I'm a little more pessimistic, because I know that things like AIs can cause a propensity for people to disengage from their own moral self-sanctions, if you will, and do things that they might not otherwise do, only to pay for it much later when they have the opportunity to consider what it is that they did when the world slows down, they're not under the stress that they're under. And my research over the past 15 years has made a direct link between things like that cause cognitive dissonance, that can lead to post-traumatic stress, that can lead to self-harm, up to and including suicide, which I did a massive study on in 16. It was published on combat veteran suicide, and this was a large part of that conversation. And I don't see AI, the risks in AI that we've discussed, and with the values and things like that, I don't see them being much different. I see them being more similar and more concerning than I think most people are thinking right now. They're so focused on all the positives of AI, and believe me, there are many, and I would love to discuss those sometime. It's just that I don't know that we have the structure in place to keep people from using it in ways that could be very destructive, not just to individuals, but to large portions of the population. That's the part that is terrifying to me. It's really, maybe it's my intelligence background, I don't know, but it's the bad actor, and look at the scams and all the things, the fraud that's going on right now. They're using AI to commit a lot of these crimes. I just, that's where I see it going. So when you ask if I'm pessimistic, yes. Am I hopeful? Yes. I'm both. I'm realistic too, and I know that we can do what we can do, and that's why I appreciate what you're doing so much, because these are the conversations that need to be had.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I mean, I appreciate that, and I believe that every human being that's connected to a digital device is actually interacting with AI on a daily basis, and they don't realize it. I feel that the increase in suicidality and depression is not in any way even questionably uncorrelated to these things. It is directly correlated, and there is an increase in the downside impacts of physiological and psychological outcomes for people to these things. And all we can do is keep the conversations going and try and find solutions in in a bipartisan approach, as opposed to making it politicized and single party issue kind of focused. So less of what I believe versus what you believe, and more what we combinedly feel that would be better for individuals and humanity. But I mean, ultimately, if we take, as the Japanese would say, a Soshin mind, or in the Zen aspects, the kind of beginner's mind principle, or as Bertrand Russell said, the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are so certain of themselves and everything, and the wise people are so full of doubts. What we have to be is that beginner's mind. We have to be curious and naive to things that we can still learn, as opposed to, from a psychological and heuristics and biases standpoint, what's called the argumentative theory of reason, which is kind of arguing for the point of winning the argument, as opposed to having a discussion for the objective of learning, which is seldom, and I'm hoping is less seldom over time. And maybe that's correlated to why, without any form of promotion, Ethics TV is somehow getting tens and tens and tens and tens of thousands of viewers, because I have to, I don't have to, but I've chosen to believe that that's because there is some form of wave of thinking that this is an important lens to discuss things through. And also the diversity of the guests is, I mean, Justine, who puts together the guest list for this, has basically just found all of the people in the web who are talking about these kind of things and invited them all on, and everyone's like, sure thing. So, that's our entire strategy.
I could give you a couple of names if
Yes, please. Yes, please. Because
these are the people I get to hang out with every once in a while, every year at a conference at least.
Right. Well, I mean, I'd love some more names, because also I'm thinking about maybe in a few months' time having a kind of an online meeting of the guests. Like when I get to kind of maybe 20, 22, 23 guests, I'll then get everyone to kind of we'll have a kind of a combined chat, sort of with a kind of a free form hangout. Maybe, allow people to bring beer and wine and whatever you fancy, and because I think what probably happens with Ethics TV, I mean, there's no agenda to it, but I'm hoping what happens is that we start to solutionize to some extent, or standardize things that seem to be apparent. So that's why I kind of floated the laws of robotics and the paradox associated. That's kind of a common theme that comes up. There's something around the regulations part. There's the lightweight regulations that some are trying. Some of the guests have, send a form to an organization and say, tick these boxes if you're acting ethically, and then they send the form back, and I'm like, that may or may not be effective. Whereas there's others who are kind of like, so I think we need to discuss these things.
That may not be the Foyer effect, right? I'm gonna answer the way I think they want me to answer. Yeah.
Right.
That's the problem. Well, I mean, look at ethics training. I mean, at least that's starting to change. I remember 20 years ago when we would have our annual ethics training, and I'm talking about multiple firms I worked at and things, and it was a common knowledge that ethics training was kind of a joke. It was like, how fast can I click through this? And but now people are. It's not that the training is a lot different in a lot of places, but it is starting to change. I have noticed the difference even in the way that people are having discussions about ethical issues at work, and in the workplace. There's books being written about it. Esther Reed from Exeter wrote a book. I think it's called Good Work, how to being ethical at work, and when so these people are writing about this stuff, and I just think that we're at a point in history where I think we have the technology to have conversations like we're having from across the globe, and we need to have more of them, and they need to become more related to when here, I'll just tell you one last thing real interesting about that many people don't know about. C.S. Lewis wrote the book Mere Christianity, and when he writes this book, most people don't know that when he wrote that book, those were lectures that he read on a radio program on the BBC. It was actually this was written to common people. They weren't at Oxford with them. They hadn't gone to Cambridge, right? These were ex-sailors and construction workers, and that's who he was speaking to. But if you read that book now, it's hard to believe that most people would even be able to really comprehend what he was getting at. And I don't want to lean too much on some of the books that have been written about sort of the dumbing down of education and all of these things, but I do think there is a factor involved that goes back to this information overload on the one hand, how we develop people on the other hand, and what we've lost is this art of communicating with one another about difficult topics in a respectful way, and in a way where we can learn something from each other. I mean, I learned something from you tonight. I hope the exchange is equal. I mean, but we need to have more of these conversations, and I am seeing that starting. So there's my hope. I explained my pessimism, but I am hopeful, and I'm thankful that you're taking on such a worthy endeavor.
Well, thank you, and Kirk, I think you are an embodiment to some extent of Mere Christianity in terms of the intent of his writing. And one of my favorite Mere Christianity quotes speaks to what I feel from your personality, which is the one of seeking something that is the best possible outcome here. And I'm going to paraphrase my vague recollection of the quote, which is something along the lines of, we need not despair, even in our worst, for our failures are forgiven. And then he says something like, the only fatal thing to do is to sit down content with anything less than perfection. And so what I pick from you is that there are concerns, but the bigger concern would be for us to not strive for there to be something better than this. And you are an embodiment of that. And the work that you've been doing is testament to it. And so I really appreciate you coming on Ethics TV, and I have zero doubt you'll be on again, whether it's for our kind of hangout that we do that I've literally just come up with the idea of as we were speaking, or maybe a future episode once the paper's published. But Kirk, thank you so much for your time, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jonathan. I really appreciate it.
Cheers, dude.
Have you ever wondered why so many useful apps are completely free to use? If you're thinking it's too good to be true, you might be onto something. Here's the catch. 1. They're funded by intrusive ads. 2. The companies that own these applications collect vast amounts of data from their users and sell it to the highest bidder. For example, you share your location with Google Maps, walk into a gym, and like magic, an ad for dumbbells pops up on your Facebook feed within the hour. This isn't a coincidence. The data collected by tech giants is weaponized by psychologists and used across the entire spectrum of technological experiences to promote addictive behavior, encourage unnecessary consumption, and maintain filter bubbles. And this is just the beginning. In the future, AI companies may continue to prioritize profit over privacy and user sovereignty, monetizing user data and manipulating information flow. However, many users aren't comfortable with the direction this is heading. At Self and Entirety, we do things differently. We choose an ethics-first approach. Everything we do is in service to our users and in line with our overarching values. Why prioritize ethics? Because in a world increasingly dominated by AI-driven systems, every human should be able to fully trust that their data isn't being sold to third parties. It's secured by the highest levels of protection available. and that they can access, control, and delete their data at any time. Our two core product offerings, Self and Entirety, heavily prioritizes data ownership, user control, security, and ethics. Visit self.app to get started.